Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we are going to be answering a question that I get a lot of late, and that's going to be, Dread, why haven't you played Falconer yet? And to answer this question, we're going to have to deep dive into ARPG balance and what it means to be an ARPG and stuff like that, right? So let's talk about it in detail. If you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of supporting content like this on YouTube. So let's dig into it, shall we? So to start off, let's talk about for me specifically, okay? What is an RPG? Like, why do I like Last Epoch? Why do I like Path of Exile? Why do I like these games? Well, a lot of these games are more about the journey than the destination. And what do I mean to that? You start off scrappy, young, no gear whatsoever, right? You feel garbage, right? And then you build up and you work towards becoming really strong, right? You end up killing, whatever like MacGuffin ends up being the thing. Like in this case, be like an Oribus at like 1,000 corruptions, something like that, right? And the journey to said Oribus, right, is the main drive of me playing because I like taking a build from meh to really good, right? And this requires intelligent planning. This requires you to actually, you know, build your defenses properly. It requires you to build up your damage properly while also balancing your defenses. It requires you to optimize your skill setup. It requires you to essentially play the build and work on it and finish it per se, right? And that's what I've done a lot of times over the past few years with all of my characters, right? I take a concept, an idea, and I push it to the absolute extreme. Whether or not that concept works or not half the time, that's just Last Epoch being Last Epoch. But, I still try it anyways. And that's most of the fun, to be honest. Taking a build and actually pushing it to the extreme. That's where I have fun. Okay. A lot of other people, they like the power fantasy. They like being at the end result for a very long time. They like, pushing to infinite amounts of corruption. They like doing these kind of things, right? But that's not what I find fun. Okay. I actually like having a challenge. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you take a character and you're trying to make it better and you're trying to make it feel good, there is a little bit of a challenge with that because you need to like understand esoteric concepts like build efficiency and stuff like that, button efficiency. You need to understand like gearing efficiency, right? Like pros and cons. You have to understand like gear weighting, like, hey, what could this piece of gear be giving me and what could this other piece of gear be giving me and why is this one better than this one, why am I running this specific skill set instead of this specific skill set. You gotta like understand that kind of stuff and actually put it to use. And that's what I like about ARPGs, right? And for the most part, Last Epoch has been like that for a long time now, where you have to actually put in a little bit of effort to make a good build. And then, we got all the teasers for Falconer, and that all went out the window. And that is mainly because I'm going to put out a very contentious take here. I think Falconer is probably one of the worst designed masteries we've ever gotten. And what do I mean by that? But Dread, Falconer is amazing. It's great. It does a lot of damage. It's very tanky. It does everything I need it to do. And that's where the problem is, okay? So whenever I play a build or I play a new build, there's always some sort of weakness involved in said build, right? Whether that be, I'm playing this Smite Electrified Javelin here, Javelin build here, and I need like more mobility. That's why I'm running Healing Hands as a mobility skill on top of Javelin, so that I have two mobility skills and I feel like as though I'm faster. Because generally, sentinels have very bad mobility. So the addition of healing hands makes it so that I can actually have better mobility than other sentinels, right? And that solves the biggest issue with this build. When I play a minion build, like a forged weapons build, right, I need to make sure that my minions are tanky enough so that when they take damage, they don't instantly die, right? That's the downside of the forged weapons build. You can get a lot of damage out of the forged weapons. They feel pretty good to play now. The only problem is you have to make sure that they don't die, right? When I'm playing, like, I'm trying to think of a good example here. When I'm playing insert like Rune Master / Sork build, I'm constantly running out of mana. That's the weakness of those builds, right? For the most part, right? Like I'm running out of mana, yada yada yada, and that's the difference, right? All these builds that I just listed, for the most part, other than specific instances that we won't get into right now, they all have weaknesses. Now, these weaknesses, they can be waylaid, they can be like fixed to a certain extent, but they will always exist. Like my Sentinel will always have worse mobility than an Acolyte, right? I can't teleport 2 screens away. My forged weapons, if they take too much damage, they will still die, even if I invest a lot of investment into them, right? I can invest as much as I can to make mana good on a Sork or whatever, but not only does that take a lot of investment, that also reduces my damage output because those affixes that are used for mana management could have been used for damage, right? Now, Falconer doesn't have that, okay? Falconer doesn't have a weakness, okay? That's the problem, okay? That's the problem with Falconer, is because you have the Falcon, right? Now, let's talk about like potential weaknesses for Falconer and why they don't have the weakness, right? So, Falconer, like, okay, it's a minion. Well, it's a minion that's immune. Well, that's one weakness that all the other minion builds in the game have. So you're already like ruining that balance, right? If Falconer actually had an HP bar that you had to scale into, then it dealing a bunch of damage would actually feel okay because you have to scale that damage with minion survivability, right? That's why, like Stormcrows, for instance, right, do a very large amount of damage, but nobody plays them because their survivability is ick, right? And that's why, it's like weird that Falcon, right, is immune to damage, right? Sure. So since it's immune to damage, that must mean that you need to invest a lot to make the damage high, right? No. If you don't know, Falconer does a lot of damage right now. A very, 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 very large amount of damage, in fact. Like, absurd amounts of damage. It feels like as though they were worried that people weren't going to be able to make the build work, so they decided to ramp up the numbers by 11, which, is very apparent if you look at, like Falconer in general, right? So, and as a minion that is immune, okay? So that's one benefit it has, that it could have been a weakness. It has insane amounts of damage scaling, right? Which is another weakness it could have had, but it does not. It's a strength. And then, well, what about survivability for you? Well, you're playing a rogue, and rogue's high-end survivability is some of the highest in the entire game. So, and Falconer's tree is absolutely insane for that. So, no, Falconer actually has insane survivability, especially if you go the low life route, right? And get a lot of EHP for free and stuff like that, especially with Merchant's Guild. So, you have a character that has a minion that's immune, so no weakness there. A character that does a lot of damage, okay, for very little investment. A character that's very defensive for very little investment, right? You also have a lot of mobility because you're playing a rogue, for God's sakes, right? You have access to shift. Of course, you're, very mobile, right? You have all these things, right? And no weaknesses, okay? And that kind of breaks that kind of breaks an ARPG when you have a build that has no weakness, because then all of a sudden it's like, well, it kind of takes over everything else. Now, that's the first part of Falconer that's badly designed. The second part of Falconer that's badly designed is how Falconer as a mastery is a one-trick pony. You have your Falcon, that's it. If you're playing a Falconer build without your Falcon, you probably should be playing a Blade Dancer or whatever, because like the Falcon, if the Falcon isn't giving you much utility, right, you probably should be playing something that is giving you better utility, right? And that ends up being a problem. So like whenever I play a Falconer, I'm kind of bored because, there's only one Falconer build, right? Like one kind of Falconer build. Sure, you can change the flavor of the Falcon, right? Like how the Falcon's dealing damage, but you're never getting away from said Falcon. And this is me wondering, well, Dread, it's the Falconer. It should be able to build around like falconry, right? Well, let me give you an example. Warlock is all about curses. But whenever I play a Warlock, I can like do 20 different builds, right? Sure, they're not all the same power level as each other, right? There are some that are imbalanced, but I can still play those builds even like, and they're still serviceable, right? I can play a Warlock build and not feel like as though I'm shoehorned into the same skill. Now, you could say the same thing about Chthonic Fissure, as Perry said back in the past, but it's nowhere near to the same extent that Falconer is right now, in my humble opinion, right? I could easily see a Warlock build not using and eschewing Chthonic Fissure versus a Falconer eschewing Falcon, because if you're not playing a Falcon, well, you're playing a Blade Dancer, right? So this is how it is. And let's talk about this even more. Whenever I think about playing a Falconer, I don't get the anywhere near the amount of same joy that I get when I think about playing like a Warlock. When I think about playing a Warlock, I'm like, oh, wow, I haven't played Zombie Warlock. I haven't played Chaos Bolts Warlock. I haven't played this flavor of Chthonic Fissure or that flavor of Chthonic Fissure. There's some Infernal Shade shenanigans I could be doing right now. There's some Rip Blood shenanigans I could be doing on Warlock. There's a lot of things I could be doing on Warlock right now. And sure, Warlock has some overpowered builds, right? Like Ghost Flame right now. But at the same time, like, I could still play other Warlock builds and still have a great time and do content that's normal, right? That normal builds do, i.e., like to the 700 to 1000 corruption mark, right? And that's my issue with Falconer, and in general, just builds like that are like that, where they kind of just don't have any weaknesses. Like, for instance, the recent Frostclaw Elemental Nova build recently. It's like, oh, Jared, why haven't you played that? It's like, dude, I have. I've played a different flavor of it in the past. If you look, I was actually one of the first people to play it. If you go look back in time, like, oh, look, I played the Ignite Sork version. Oh, Dread, well, that's not the same thing as like the Spark Charge version. Like, don't you think that I was thinking about the Spark Charge version when I was playing the Ignite version? I was like, huh, I could play the Spark Charge version. That'd be cool. Right? Also, the version I was playing was insanely bugged because the Elemental Nova AoEs weren't proper. Like, as soon as that was fixed, it, like, doubled the damage of that build. And then, of course, the mana stuff, right? The bugs with Gift of Winter causing it to overperform in terms of mana sustain and stuff like that. All of that combined, it's just like, well, like, I've already played it, so why would I play it again? Sure, it's a different flavor of the build, right? But like, it's the same build, it just does more damage because instead of going with a mechanic that sucks like Ignite, you go with a mechanic that works very well in endgame, which is Spark Charges, right? Like, it doesn't really take a it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that Spark Charge Elemental Nova Frostclaw would have been a very good build. And that was exactly the build that I was thinking about, but then didn't end up playing because guess what? Haha, it's OP, right? And like I said, that build specifically, right, has a lot of the same problems that Falconer has, right, in terms of the no weaknesses. But the thing is, Falconer is an entire mastery, while that Frostclaw Nova Spark setup is one build on Rune Master. Now, Rune Master has a few builds that are like that, but still, that's only one build on Rune Master. While with my problem with Falconer is it's the entire mastery. So instead of having one build that has no weaknesses, which can easily get fixed in the next patch, right? Or if it's bugged, yada yada yada, whatever, right? It's a whole mastery. And now I'm stuck in the situation where it's like, well, I'm probably not going to play it, and until like it gets like a lot of balance changes. Like, for instance, it took them years and years to balance stuff like all the other rogue shenaniganry, right? Like, it took them a very long time to get Shadow Daggers into a place where it didn't feel oppressive, right? To the point where I could play other rogue builds without feeling as though, oh, I should be playing Shadow Daggers, right? So like I don't know how long it's going to take for them to actually get Falconer into the place where it needs to be. And I don't think it's ever going to get to that point. I think it's always going to end up having that same problem of being a one trick pony. Like the weakness of Falconer is it's just boring in the end, right? At least in terms of like if you want to play more than just one build. And Falconer is amazing for people who are new to the game, mainly because, you know, like you don't really have to put in that much effort for it to be strong, which is fine. Like there are builds that should exist that are like that, right? Like for instance, right now, Torment Warlock is a good example of a build that doesn't have to put in that much effort to do well, but it still has a cap. It still has its weaknesses and stuff like that, right? But like those can exist without being as one trick pony ish as like Falconer, right? So yeah, that's why I haven't played Falconer. Is because it breaks the fundamentals of an ARPG. It has no weaknesses, which is why it is boring. It eventually gets boring, and it's just not worth my time. There are other builds and other things I could play that are way more fun and way more like entertaining to play than a bird that has no weaknesses. So, with all that being said, this has been Dread. I'll have to go do something else. Bye.